Come in. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me.
Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson that is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. The room and its contents all vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets on a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, and she laid the cloth assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, they danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid, to be let out and peeled. "Whatever has got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother Tiny Tim, and Martha weren't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," cried a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her bonnet and shawl for her. "Well, we'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear it all away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you were come. Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." "No, no! There's father coming!" cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and his limbs were supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" said Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity, and he had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken. And while Bob compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigour. Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce, Martha dusted the hot plates, and Bob took Tiny Tim beside him to the little corner at the table. and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last, the dishes were set on, and grace was said. This was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Well, everyone had had enough. The young Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone. Too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose someone should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello. A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding. Like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then the whole Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and Bob served out the hot stuff with beaming looks as the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool, and Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed," said Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'll give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day. Why, it should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks the health to such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. Well, you know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." I'll drink his health for your sake in the days, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Well, he'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. All this time, the chestnuts and the jug went round and by they had a song from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, pleased, grateful with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge as this scene vanished to hear a hearty laugh. It was an even greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, looking at that same nephew. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live, said Scrooge's nephew. And he believed it, too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece by marriage indignantly. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking. He's a comical old fellow, and that's the truth, said Scrooge's nephew. And not as pleasant as he might be. Still, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us, and won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor is a wretched outcast who has no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung a glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have drunk to the unconscious company in an inaudible speech. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the Spirit were once again upon their travels. Much they saw and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The Spirit stood by sick beds, and they were cheerful. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the Spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. Suddenly, as they stood together in an open place, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, but saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.